a Sigmund Freud beard and glasses. I wondered, is this my mom feeling better? She cried all the way home, a 20-minute drive. I didn't know what was going on or what kind of doctor she'd been seeing. I wondered if they had hurt her or used scary instruments on her. At home, the crying got even worse, and as she often did, she walked into her room and slammed the door. I heard her screaming, "Papa, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." But she didn't sound mad. She wasn't yelling at anyone, and this was strange to me. Normally when she acted like that, she came back out screaming. But she wasn't mad, not at me or her sisters or my dad or anyone. I was confused, so I waited until the light faded away and it turned dark. Then my brothers came home, and at 5:30 my mom came out and made us dinner. It was as if nothing had happened. That kind of crying happened more after she got out of the hospital. This was also when she started to self-medicate. Her philosophy was if the doctor told her one pill would make her feel less blue, then maybe she should take two. She'd go to the doctor and get a prescription, then go to a different doctor and get a different prescription. Then she'd go to a third doctor for a third. She collected pills. Because she wouldn't level with any of the doctors, and because none of them knew about her other medications, it was impossible for them to diagnose her. That added to her downward spiral. When she moved out of the house years later, her medicine cabinet was full of pills. My brother Anthony, who packed her up, told me that she had harder stuff than anything he'd ever found on the street when he was younger. Because of what was happening at home, I was the kind of kid who wanted to evaporate in public. I never wanted any trouble, never wanted to draw attention to myself. I became very good at compensating, so friends who came over couldn't tell what was happening with my mom. On the days she was feeling well, my friends and I hung out at the house. But if a buddy came over after school and it was one of her off days, I'd quickly say, "Hey, why don't we go to the park?" But sometimes circumstances made that difficult. My mother insisted on being the class mother for my field trips. This was incredibly anxiety-producing for me. She could have a meltdown at any moment. Plus, she was almost always late, which meant there was ample opportunity for a dramatic entrance. That alone would draw the kind of attention I wanted to avoid. The first few years I was in school, I had been safe. Then came my 4th grade trip to the Empire State Building. My class was leaving for the city on a bus a few hours after the school day had begun, which meant my mom would have to meet us at school. When it was time to leave, all the kids were sitting in their seats on the bus, and our teacher stood in the front, checking his watch. There was no sign of my mother. My leg bounced up and down with nerves as we waited and waited and waited for my mom to show up. Finally, the teacher said to me, "We're going to have to leave in 2 minutes." Then my mom came screeching up in her car, threw it in park, jumped out, and ran onto the bus. She was panting as she said, I'm so sorry I'm late." Already, I was not invisible. I remember it being excruciatingly embarrassing. I didn't think it could get worse, until we got to the top of the Empire State Building. I was looking out over the city on the observation deck when I heard screaming. I turned around and saw my mom, with one high heel on and the other in her hand, gripping it as if it were a weapon, chasing some of my classmates. She was yelling at them to stop misbehaving and start listening. They were half laughing, half wondering why this woman, Gary's mom, was coming after them. At one point, the heel on the shoe she was wearing broke, and she started screaming at the kids for making her break her shoe. I wanted to go into a corner of the building and die, or better yet, throw myself off the observation deck. For the rest of that year, the kids asked me what was wrong with my mother. I was the kid in class with the crazy mom. My mom was oblivious to how the incident could scar a 4th grader for life. Instead, she'd bring it up and say, "Can you believe how badly those kids were behaving?" But for the most part, no one outside of our house and immediate family knew the extent of what was happening with my mom. My dad didn't call the school when she was in the hospital to let my teacher know, and it's not like she walked around the neighborhood trading pills with other housewives or muttering to herself in her housecoat. Her manic incidents were isolated enough, once a week some months and none during others, that if you heard screaming from my house, you'd just think someone was having an argument. You knew that was blue-collar and Italian. Screaming was commonplace. My mom's issues stemmed as much from her temper as they did from any mental instability. There was a line she crossed where one gave way to the other, like she couldn't find an off switch. One day we went to the A&S department store in Hempstead to buy me new school clothes. My mom tried to pay with a credit card that was in my father's name, but the saleslady wouldn't accept it. Naturally, my mother flew into a rage. She started throwing my clothes, which were sitting in a pile on the counter, at the lady. Those were followed by the black Chuck Taylor high tops I'd picked out. One of the Chucks hit the saleslady in the head while she was on the phone with security. That's when we sprinted out of the store to avoid getting arrested. The temper problems meant that even when my mom was in the right, she could occasionally wind up in the wrong. In our part of town, she had a lot of friends, but she also had a lot of people she perceived to be her enemies. That's how it was with her. Everything was black and white. You were her friend, or you were her enemy. Our next-door neighbors happened to be enemies. The houses on my street were practically on top of one another, separated by just a thin driveway. The older son next door was just a grade ahead of me, and for some reason, he had it in for me. He constantly beat the crap out of me. It became a regular topic of conversation in my house. What are we going to do about Gary getting beaten up? I was in 3rd grade. Finally, one warm spring afternoon, my mom decided she was going to go next door and have a chat with the guy's mom. It was just like out of the Brady Bunch, when Peter was getting picked on, and Mike and Carol went over to the bully's house, expecting everyone to be reasonable. Except in my case, they weren't. With me on her heels, my mom walked over and knocked on our neighbor's door. I noticed a lot of kids playing in the street. I stopped by myself at the very edge of the property line, on the driveway, which meant I was still pretty close to listen to the conversation. I had never been in their house and was really anxious about being as close as I was. Our neighbor opened her screen door, but instead of inviting my mom in, she stepped out onto the top step of the 3-step stoop. My mom said, "I want your son to leave my son alone." So far, so good. A perfectly reasonable request. Carol Brady would have been proud. Then our neighbor answered in a flippant, casual tone, "Well, maybe your son can defend himself." Uh-oh. I can't remember who dropped the first F-bomb, but in a matter of seconds they were flying. The neighbor was yelling, "Fuck you." My mom yelled it back, and then my mom pushed her. My first thought was, let's get out of here now, Mom. This isn't working. We should walk away right now. I knew that my mom would get herself worked up, and it would be impossible to stop this thing from escalating. There would be no turning back. Our neighbor couldn't believe she'd been pushed. She stood there, her mouth open, like she was watching a scary movie. Only she was in it. Now people were starting to gather around. The kids who had been playing ball on the street dropped their bats and stared. Then my mom took it to another level. There were shrubs and a flower bed just to the side of our neighbor's stoop, underneath the big bay window. As the woman stood there, my mom reached down and pulled up some of the shrubs. She must have caught a glimpse of the roots because she decided that they might make a good weapon. Then she started bashing our neighbor with the shrubs. Dirt was flying everywhere. By now the neighborhood parents were in the street watching too. They were fascinated, amazed, horrified, and stunned. I was petrified and embarrassed. This is not what we came here to do, I thought. My mom had started out in the right, and now she was beating our neighbor with her shrubbery. Someone must have called the cops because the next thing we knew a squad car pulled up with the lights flashing. Really? The cops?